name is Lesley Bartlett. I'm an associate professor at Teachers College, Columbia University. And we're here mostly to celebrate the inauguration of Project LEAD and the important work that the faculty at the College of Education here at UTEP are going to be doing in collaboration with local schools on bilingual education. Specifically, Ofelia Garcia and I came to talk about a book that we completed a couple of years ago. It's called Additive Schooling in Subtractive Times. And the book is a case study of a bilingual high school for newcomer immigrant youth in New York City. The youth are primarily Dominican, and they've all been in the country fewer than 6 months. And what intrigued us about this school was that they were having unusual success in graduating this population of newcomer immigrant youth, and so we were interested in what they're doing. How are they managing to do that? So the book looks at how they support, how the educators at Gregorio Luperón High School in New York City support young people academically, socioculturally, and linguistically.
Books include Teaching Intention, International Pedagogies and National Policies and Teachers' Practices in Tanzania. Another text co-authored is Refugees, Immigrants, and Education in the Global South, Lives in Motion, co-edited with Amina Gafir Kucher, and Bilingual Education and Dominican Immigrant Youth in the Heights, co-written with Ofelia Garcia. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Lesley Bartlett, whose talk today is entitled Additive Schooling in Subtractive Times, Bilingual Education.
So much for that warm welcome. I really appreciate it. I want to congratulate the faculty of Socorro High School and the district for the inspiring example you set for all of us. I want to thank Dr. Izquierda and Dr. Ullman, the indomitable faculty of the College of Education here at UTEP, for this warm welcome that you've extended to me and Ofelia. We're so glad to be here with you. And I'm going to talk tonight then about a book that Ofelia and I co-authored. We had the incredible good fortune of working with a number of really talented students on this project, and their names are listed here. Some of them are now completing their doctorates, so look for them. They're doing some fascinating work. This is work, though, that we did in New York in a bilingual high school that was primarily for Dominican youth. It was all for newcomer immigrant youth from Latin America and the Caribbean, but about somewhere between 70 and 85% Dominican for the years that we were there. And so imagine that Ofelia is right here with me, presenting this work, and of course she'll participate in the question and answer period afterward. This was a project that I very much enjoyed working on with Ofelia for about 4.5 years. So I wanted to start with one of the puzzles that drew us to this work, and that is the incredible dropout rates for Latinos, U.S. and foreign-born Latinos in New York City. This is some data collected by colleagues of ours, Rosenbaum and Cortina, and it shows final discharge status for Latinos by place of birth, for one cohort. You can see here that the U.S. mainland-born, Puerto Rican-born, Dominican, and Mexican-born have some of the highest dropout rates and other discharge status and some of the lowest graduation rates, doing significantly worse, really, than other Central American and certainly than South American-born youth. And so this was one of the things that concerned us this discharge status and these high dropout rates was one of the things that concerned us as we thought about secondary schooling for immigrant youth. That Rosenbaum and Cortina showed only 42% of Dominican-born youth graduating, and that the New York official statistics from the DOE showed a Latino graduation rate of only 53% in 2007 and 63% in other years. But we were particularly interested in this one bilingual high school, a very unusual, unique high school, that demonstrated an 83% graduation rate in 2000, in a 4-year period, and a 76% 6-year graduation rate the year previous to that. The school was experiencing significantly higher rates of success with immigrant youth, newcomer immigrant youth, than the overall average in the school. And one of the things that we were really curious about is, what explains this? How are they achieving this? There were other things that drove us to want to be successful in one of those. So this school is located in Manhattan, in in Washington Heights. You can see north of Harlem. And Washington Heights then is a neighborhood that has been for decades now historically immigrant, but for many years primarily Puerto Rican, and then successively Dominicans began settling more frequently in the area. The school is called Gregorio Luperón High School. At the time that we started our study, this was the entrance to the actual school. It was a converted warehouse with not nearly enough space for the students who were enrolled. It was an alternative high school for newcomer immigrants, started as a transitional program. The thought was they were going to have a 2-year program, get the students prepared with academic English, and then send them off to 4-year schools. And there was a significant amount of debate over whether to move to become a 4-year school or not, but ultimately they decided to make that commitment primarily because they were getting these students ready, sending them out, and then the students were dropping out 6 months after moving to another comprehensive high school. It was overcrowded. Regularly, the faculty performed choir drills. I remember that very clearly from our first couple of years at the school. They were very concerned about getting the students out in time should anything happen, getting them up and down these tight corridors. The students are Spanish-speaking with various levels of Spanish literacy levels and divergent educational backgrounds, primarily Dominican, but even those that are Dominican have very different backgrounds, whether they've been in urban areas, whether some of them had attended private schools, most of them had not. 73% technically eligible for free lunch. And at the time we started our study, there were 23 teachers. 15 of them were themselves Dominican. And there were 3 to 4 administrators, actually at different points, 2 versus 3 of them were themselves immigrant. So the question that we, took a while. The first year we were hanging out, we were trying to figure out what mattered at the school, what was important. Ophelia sat in the Spanish literacy classes, I sat in the ESL classes, as we tried to understand what was going on at this school. And eventually we came up with the question, how does Luperón support newly arrived immigrant students? Focusing on 3 aspects: socioculturally, academically, and linguistically. So that was the question that drove our interest. And we used several framing literatures. We used literatures, obviously, on bilingual education and on second language multilingual literacies and critical literacies. That was a very important strand of our inquiry. We used literature on migration and education, specifically related to segmented assimilation theory and cultural ecological theory that we engaged as we thought about this study and as we then analyzed the data. Obviously, studies of Latino education. And we drew also pretty heavily on critical educational policy studies with a focus on New York. Briefly, the methods that we engaged. In the first year, we did, as I described, participant observation in ESL and Spanish literacy classes. We did a survey of 59th graders just to get a sense of the landscape, who these students were. We did focus groups, 7 focus groups, each of them with 10 students, and they were in level 1 or 2 ESL, and then some initial interviews. And we were very really lucky in that first year of our engagement that the teachers were interested in doing some professional development. So it was a very organic process of meeting with teachers, hearing what they thought the concerns were and what strategies had developed for addressing those concerns. It included some descriptive inquiry and some other processes. And that was a really important period for us to get their perspective on the school. In the second year, in years 2 to 5, we selected a cohort of 20 students, 29 graders, that we followed across 4 years. So participant observation, regular participant observation with those students, following them through their school day, and at least an annual interview. Sometimes we interviewed them more frequently, and there was certainly a lot more informal interviewing of them, but one formal interview per year. We also conducted interviews with the teachers and with the administrators, interviews with parents and participant observation at PTA meetings, and interviews with founders of the school. So the title of our book is Additive Schooling in Subtractive Times. And I want to focus now on the additive schooling part, and I'm going to focus at the end of the talk on the subtractive times. There were several challenges that the youth identified, sociocultural and academic challenges, that the youth identified as critical to their experience, and that we saw the school adapting to in very specific ways that were, as Dr. Serrano said, student-centered, right? Putting students and their needs and interests at the center of the school's response. So the first is, students expressed a very serious sense of social dislocation. They were newly arrived, they had come from very different environments, they felt they felt really delimited in terms of mobility. They weren't that familiar with the city, they didn't feel safe. Their families were fairly protective of them, and they had a very tight route of traveling to school and traveling back home, at least in the first year of their time in New York City. And of course, a very different relationship to space as well, in their housing being cramped up in apartments versus houses being indoors, especially during the winter, as opposed to their usual sense of space and time. And time was an issue too. They were experiencing much longer school days than they had previously. And so the students described feeling trancado, feeling locked up, feeling pinned in. So concern for that sense of safety and mobility was central to faculty response. Also, spending a good bit of time and energy building social capital, both between teachers and students and among peers. That was a focus. A very strong sense of culturally relevant pedagogy and curriculum that I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. The guiding metaphor for cultural interactions at the school was a family metaphor, and I want to discuss that. And then I think another critical aspect, critical ingredient in the success of the school in terms of sociocultural and academic support for the youth was an active political presence for parents. I'm going to address that. So Stan Salazar has this wonderful quote that I found, for me, was really illuminating when I thought about relationships that were built at the school and their importance. He said, if academic success is contingent upon engagement with agents who control access to institutional resources that are vital to educational achievement and attainment, then our paradigm for understanding success and failure in school has to be a relational one. That we have to think about relationships as central to that endeavor. And then we saw the teachers doing this very deliberately with students. Teachers used themselves as models. They talked about their own immigration experiences, their own schooling, their own use of school to open up paths for social and economic mobility. So for example, there was one assistant principal who was teaching an advanced Spanish class in which students wrote their autobiographies, and she wrote and read hers aloud to give them a sense of her own struggle. There were very high expectations that were regularly communicated to the students, usually in the form of teasing, but sort of not quite teasing, right? So one student proudly showed a teacher her grade of 82%, and he said, yeah, where are the other 18 points? You know, he was not going to cut her any slack on that one. And as one teacher said, we see them as whole students, we see their strengths and their weaknesses. So he felt that given his own immigration experience, he was able to see his students more holistically. There was a very strong sense of cultural knowledge and the way that teachers built that into their pedagogical techniques, obvious knowledge of food, cities, traditions. This was particularly true, of course, with the Dominican students and Dominican teachers. Knowledge about Dominican Haitian struggles. So one of the English teachers who was teaching Maus and about Jewish people in Germany during the war, comparing that very bluntly with Dominican Haitian struggles in a way that generated some really intense discussion. The use of monadejas, and then just the fact that teachers understood discourse structures in Spanish versus in English, in writing and in math, and they were able to translate the genre for the students in really important ways. Another piece that demonstrated this sense of culturally relevant pedagogy was the use of autobiographical writing. You can see here one bulletin board that gives an example of that. Writing on topics such as my siblings, my greatest treasure, these sorts of things in ways that encourage students to bring their experiences, their values, their beliefs, their relationships into the school and into their academic learning. The family metaphor. The family metaphor reigned at this school. It was very important. And, you know, so for example, one of the secretaries said, aquí uno no piensa en los sueldos, se piensa de los muchachitos. A founder said, todo por nuestra comunidad y por nuestros muchachos. And one of the rich gems exemplifying this family metaphor for us came when one of the students in the study described Luperon as, it's like an umbilical cord. And he meant that in two ways, which he elaborated. He said, on the one hand, it's nourishing, it's sustaining. It's what allows you to develop, right, in this new environment. And on the other hand, it keeps you really close. And it was interesting the way he then analyzed that umbilical cord and how he felt like he needed that sustenance at this moment in his life, but he was also eager to graduate and to go on and to be more distant and more independent. A final element then of the kind of sociocultural support given to the students and to their families came through the active cultivation of parent engagement. Parents and community-based organizations, they drew on community-based organizations for after-school activities. Like one of the teachers set up a research project through City College. He himself was an alumnus of City College, and he used every chance he could get to get those high school students onto the college campus. Having after-school activities at the community-based organization, those sorts of things were very important. But there were other ways in which they engaged parents. A very active parent coordinator. PTA meetings were held in Spanish. The agenda was set by the PTA, and there was a very responsive school leadership. We could probably talk for 45 minutes about the school leader himself, a very charismatic person. I think we all know the importance of leadership, and we were told many really revelatory stories about the extent of his commitment and of the AP's commitment to his faculty and to the students and their parents. So these were some of the ways in which they engaged parents. I think it was also really relevant that every member of the staff spoke Spanish, and a parent never came in and needed to find a translator to get his or her message across. Everyone was bilingual at this school. As one person said, this is our school, we built it, we will be here to the end. There's a very strong sense of community ownership. heightened and strengthened then through their work to get a better school for their students, right? It was a very public campaign over many years during the course of our study to get them a better school building, to move them out of this reformed warehouse that was not sufficient in terms of capacity to include all of the students. And so they have regular protests. You know, this picture is, they have protests on the steps of the school. They wrote letters to political leaders. Parents came regularly for these protests. And so when one of the teachers said, it helps the, he was talking about the activism and its role for the students themselves. It helps these students who are only immigrants realize that just because they deserve something doesn't mean it will be given to them. So there's a strong sense of rights and of engagement with the school that way. But the parents themselves were also very involved in this campaign. So finally they did convince the mayor, first the chancellor and then the mayor, to come and visit. And this is what resulted. This is a testament, right, to the power of the Dominican community in New York City and to years of work. This took a long time for them to make happen. And it has brought its own challenges, which are worth considering. It's a much larger school. It's in a different location. For a long time, there was a struggle over where to locate it, and there was an effort by people in the Department of Ed, mostly for political purposes, to locate it outside of Washington Heights. And the parents and students strongly agitated against that. So it was eventually located within Washington Heights at a different place. But it's a larger school, which means it has a more diverse student body now. Some of them are not as recent, not as newcomers. They've perhaps gone through middle school in New York. And that also shifts the culture, not only in terms of the students' backgrounds, but in terms of the size. And those blessings bring new challenges. So I'm going to talk briefly about the sort of linguistic support that the school offered to the students. I mentioned 15 Dominican teachers. Of the 8 born in the U.S., 3 spoke Spanish at the time we were doing our study. The Dominican teachers themselves, many of them were very highly educated. They were, one was a doctor, one was an engineer. They had very strong content area backgrounds that they brought to their teaching, very practical, applied sorts of knowledge too in their subject areas. And so that was a real benefit academically to the students. One thing that was significant was the maintenance of high status for Spanish and the strong focus on a bilingual speech community. So one of our favorite quotes was from a student. She said, "Spanish is the language in which you communicate with your culture. English is like improving oneself. If you don't know English, you're not going to get anywhere. It's the most important thing after Spanish." A very strong sense of the value of both of them, and not having a sense of needing to choose, needing to be more alive with one or the other. So it wasn't always easy. This school very much went beyond the existing language models or the approved language models for New York City, which included ESL, transitional, and dual language. Now, Ophelia, this is her area of specialty, so she could speak much more eloquently about this than I would, but basically in the book we're arguing that language education should not be subtractive, that it should not try to attenuate the home language and develop only the school language. I think we all agree on that. But it also can't be simply additive. That it's not simply one language that's quite discrete plus a second language that's quite discrete. That instead, language practices are very fluid, they're dynamic. People draw on parts of the language repertoire simultaneously. Right? These are some pictures Ophelia took. I'm taking advantage of it. GPC. I'm sure you see this, right? So we need language models, we need language education models that match the language English students do, right? We need them to learn in schools what they're going to use what they are using, what they're going to use. So in the book then we talk about dynamic bilingualism, that it's complex, interconnected, and multiple. And Ofelia uses a wonderful metaphor for this, you know, the all-terrain vehicle. But it's not 1 plus 1, it's each tire gripping the terrain as it moves over it. It's using whatever is available in your linguistic repertoire. So Luperon then uses this dynamic bilingual model that matches the practices of the local speech community. In general, you could say that they move from 2 years of very intensive English classes, plus Spanish academic literacy, understanding that the students themselves are at various levels of Spanish literacy, plus content courses in Spanish for their first couple of years. And then in general, there's a move toward continued literacy supporting content courses in Spanish and English. So they might become content courses that are more, that feature English more centrally, but there's still a tendency to draw upon Spanish as a resource. And we have to acknowledge then that this is only possible, well, it's primarily possible because of the testing policy. The students can take, they must take, obviously, the English regions in English. But most of the exams, except for Math B and Chemistry, they have the option of taking in Spanish. So they can do their content classes in Spanish and prepare for the Regents exam in Spanish, which are required to graduate. So we talk then in the book about moving beyond monolingualism and even beyond the idea of bilingualism as 1 plus 1 equals 2, as if they're somehow distinct, and moving toward translanguaging, which describes complex and integrated discursive practices that bilinguals, emergent bilinguals, use. And translanguaging then as a pedagogical approach that builds on these practices, the description of these existing practices, to encourage ways of speaking and ways of being that are usually ignored or denied or constrained in schools. And so students, of course, have their own attitudes about this. They would say, you know, basically, we're getting better. It's good here because the teachers, most of them speak English and they explain it to you in Spanish, and that way we learn more. And one of them talked about, you know, mis amigos me contaron de un maestro de inglés en la otra escuela, a friend who she had a friend in another school, que sabía puritito inglés. Right? So just imagining what that's like for a student to sit in a class and not hear anything that sounds familiar or not have those explanations available. The teachers then had their own perspective on this movement between or the use of multiple repertoires. One of the teachers described it very beautifully for us. He was an English teacher, and his students were reading Junot Diaz's book, Drown. And he said, English is critical, but you can't teach them English without drawing upon Spanish. I threw that English-only teaching away. I think bilingualism is important. My understanding about language learning and cultural aspects has been deepened here. These adolescents have been taken from their communities, often under adverse family conditions. They need parents with new families. Their parents are now divorced. They're coming with an idealized view of America. If you took their language away too, it would be terribly detrimental. The metaphor of drownings is one that I can understand. I think of that when I look at these students. I try to think of their situation. They have to have their oxygen, their language. It's a really powerful testimony. So translanguaging then entails multiple things, shifting between texts in one language and discussion in another, moving across texts that feature different languages and different discourse structures, discussing in one language, checking comprehension in another, reading in one language, writing in another, moving across textual practices and discourse practices in multiple languages, including in micro-alteration. And Ophelia will be talking much more about translanguaging in her talk. The teachers also then identified what they called FOX strategies to survive assessment, given their pedagogical approach. And those FOX strategies included contextualization, included providing models of different responses and different thought processes to react to assessment items, building out predictability and redundancy, looking elsewhere for meaning, so using multiple sources of meaning. And these were some of the strategies that they taught students to survive the Regents exam. I mentioned already then that the availability of tests in Spanish and the specificity of the English targets on the English Regents made this kind of pedagogy possible. And it'd be very interesting for us, I think, to learn more about Texas testing policy and how schools for bilingual students are surviving that. I want to end then by coming to the last part of our title, which is additive schooling in subtractive times. It's not a pretty story. The school had incredible success getting these young people graduated. 4 of them did drop out. They were 4 of the most impoverished students in our sample. 3 of them were boys, and 1 was a girl. And 2 of them dropped out because of pregnancy. 2 of them dropped out because of standardized tests, because they thought they had failed English Regents several times and they did not feel it was going to be possible to finish. 4 graduated and sought work immediately. They got service and retail positions, very low end, very low income. This is pretty consistent with studies of immigrant youth, and particularly Latino immigrant youth. 8 went to community colleges, and none of those have completed a degree 4 years later. There's a lot of work for us to do in community colleges. And then 4 went to 4-year colleges, and 4 years later, only 1 had graduated. Now that 1, in May, will be finishing his master's degree at Harvard University in public policy. So 1 is significant, but 1 isn't enough, right? We cannot be content with that. This was in a 4-year period. We can expect, we hope, certainly, that over a longer period of time, we'll see better outcomes for these youth. But it is a cause for concern. And those who went to community college and were working and studying at the same time really had not managed to secure work that was any better paying than those who graduated and sought work immediately. So they were very much trapped in what Jose Itzigson calls ethno-racial stratification, the sorts of jobs that were available to Dominican youth. Itzigson and other scholars have shown that first-generation Dominicans are employed primarily in declining sectors of the economy with low wages and very high rates of unemployment and poverty. And even second generation is not that much better a story. If we look at research by Cassinet and colleagues, they found that Dominicans were doing slightly better than Puerto Ricans and African Americans, not much better, but significantly worse than other immigrant groups in their study. So it's a story of great concern, certainly. Our last chapter in the book then draws the lessons we feel are relevant from this school and potentially applicable, transferable to other locations. Now, this is a particular treat for us to speak here in El Paso, where there is so much similarity, where there is so much concentration of Spanish-speaking population. Often I'll go to places where they feel like, well, there's absolutely nothing relevant here to us because we have such a different multilingual context, multilingual ecology. But even there, I think some of these lessons are relevant. So I want to just highlight a few of them. The value, the benefit of an engaged staff and a student-centered culture, student-centered school culture, which I'm sure Socorro could teach us a lot about. The importance of leadership, the importance of teachers as agents of social capital, building those relationships relationships with youth. The clear fact that immigrant youth are served by an additive approach that's based on confianza, that fosters peer social capital rather than competition, and that builds on the students' optimism, their sense of optimism about the possibility of schooling. The importance of political engagement for the whole community, and a sense of investment in the school. Clear evidence that immigrant parents can be effectively engaged as partners in schooling, despite what some people continue to claim. Linguistic lessons, the importance of strong content area instruction was very clear to us. The value of bilingual faculty, even among those faculty who were not Spanish-English bilingual, but who had a sense of what learning a language means and what it takes. Right? That was clear to us. The importance of maintaining a high status for the home language. The value of bilingual education for promoting development of both Spanish and English literacies. The value of translanguaging pedagogy. The clear lesson that we keep learning over and over in different schools about the ways in which accountability measures significantly constrain the education of immigrant students, and the importance of, at a minimum, offering high-stakes tests in immigrant students' home languages, but with the recognition that that alone isn't enough. That's just the beginning, and the kinds of work, the kinds of curricular materials, and pedagogical training that need to accompany that are pretty clear. There's also, we're quick to acknowledge in the conclusion of this book, it's not a perfect school. We're not trying to set up this school or any other school as a perfect school. The school has its struggles. And there were particular struggles in 4 areas I want to identify here. That additive schooling is not enough, right? It may have a surprisingly limited impact on the social and economic trajectories of the students themselves. It's only a start to get them through school, and then there's so much more work to be done to get them through post-secondary and on to better paying, more rewarding work. So a second lesson for us was the really important work to be done in the school-to-work transition for those who aren't going to seek post-secondary, and even for those who are. The value and the importance of highly skilled college counselors with extensive networks became immediately evident during our work at this school. And then one element that people always are concerned about is the homogeneity, the ethnic homogeneity of the school. It's sort of somehow anti-American, right? Never mind that these students, when they are in other schools, are in highly segregated schools where there are very few white students to be found. But nevertheless, there's certainly a great need to foster positive cross-ethnic social interactions among schools, and certainly among schools with this sort of language model. So that's my presentation. I think we're going to take about 5 minutes to have questions at this point, and then Ofeda is going to pick up this translanguaging strand and develop it in a beautiful way. That will probably answer some of the questions you may have about that element. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I look forward to it.